It's early in the week, and I think it's important to go back over Module 4, Equip Assignment 4A. You might want to print off or pull out your paper so you have very specific feedback on the answers. This perhaps was one of the more difficult modules, Module 4, but also one of the most important modules. So although we're nearing the end of the course, I hope that you'll challenge yourself to learn the methods so that you can be the best preschool or elementary school possible. Don't sell yourself short. So up in the directions, I highlighted a couple of things that should have been shown in your notes, and I didn't carry this out throughout all of the examples because the yellow part on how Dillon solves the problems was probably easier for you to capture. Was he using his fingers? Was he writing on the paper pencil formality, or was he using manipulatives? Whereas labeling the problem type was a new skill and something that's important for teachers to understand. This was also presented in the chapter. The page numbers are specified up here in number 1, where it talks about addition and subtraction beginning on 149 and multiplication and division beginning on page 158. The types of problems, or the labels that I was looking for, were in green boxes. Join type, result unknown. Separate type, start unknown. So we'll go over those answers together. And also, I'll point out some of the difficulties with the problems and why this would be important for you as a pre-service teacher to begin thinking about in Math Methods 1. So on the first one, we would call that join, change unknown. There are further examples of this on page 150 of your textbook. If I were to write this down, actually I'm going to address this problem again in the reflection question at the bottom, so I've already encoded it there. When I say encode, that just means write down the numbers that align to the story problem. The second problem with the colored marbles is a part whole, and one of the parts is unknown. We know the total amount, or the whole. It's presented right in the beginning, 14. What makes this one perhaps more difficult for Dillon is that there's no action. You don't see an action verb like he's been given more, some are taken away, he lost some, etc. In number 3, this is another one I'll address down at the bottom, but the correct labeling is also found on page 150, and it's called join, also known as addition, but the start point is unknown. And Dillon was unsuccessful, and that's very common for young children. Remember that Dillon was a second grader. I think that's pretty important. In our face-to-face class, we make some predictions. We look at these problems and star the ones that we think are going to be the most challenging. And these at the bottom are always the ones that are starred. What changed at the bottom is Dillon's use of the manipulatives. But if you go back to the standards that are listed in our announcement area, we don't begin work with our multiplication and division until beyond second grade. However, we can build operation sense much earlier than second grade. As a matter of fact, when we were working with our face-to-face math buddies with first graders, they could make sense of many of these problems because of the story or the situation that they could connect with. And you'll notice too Dillon's name that's used over and over. And Ismail, I believe, is a friend of Dillon's. Something else that you might not care that much about. I've watched this video hundreds of times, and the man that's doing the interview is actually somebody that I've met before. He's a math professor in California, if he's still there. So we get down here to number 4. And again, we're talking about Dillon and his friend. And we have this, the story is changing because we can see that we're comparing. When I work with my face-to-face students, a lot of times I compare my age to their age. And our textbook talks about the curricula that schools use and the disservice that they do for children, and that so many times subtraction is presented as a takeaway problem. But that's not the correct definition of subtraction. Subtraction can be thought of as a comparison. And so if I'm comparing my age to a traditional UNK student's age, we're not taking their years off of my years. That wouldn't make sense. Instead, it's looking at comparing how many years old I am to theirs, and a number line might be a good way of showing that distance or that gap that appears in between those two ages. Number 5, we move to something that you've had some practice with your field experience students. And if you listen to my little announcement, you saw that I had the opportunity to work with a very young student as well. So putting stories with manipulatives is the way that we can build operation sense. And in Belinda's case, she could visualize then how those bowls and the cereal pieces in the bowls were making equal groups, and then she used her counting skills, whether that be skip counting or counting all, to come up with the product. So we know that's multiplication, and page 159 would show you other similar ones if you want to test yourself. Numbers 6 and 7 I'll address at the bottom again, but you see that they're related to number 5 in the heading. They're equal groups because multiplication and division are related. However, one of those is partition or fair share division. This is the type you'll more commonly see in school curricula. So we need to make sure that we can evaluate the word problems that come with our worksheets and materials, so that students also have the opportunity to use repeated subtraction and see division as measurement. And we saw the actions that Dillon used when he broke off 4 children at a time with those Unifix cubes. And again, page 159 if you want to test yourself on similar situations. For the reflection questions down at the bottom, there were other ones that you could try. When Dillon had to join and the change was unknown up in problem number 1, we could write the number sentence for that as 6 and how many more will equal 13. And because he knew the start, he could count on from 6, so we've used the skill of counting on now as a learning indicator for some of our games for our young math buddy, and we saw that he was successful in doing that as a 2nd grade student. Whereas for number 3, when this start is unknown, it makes it a more difficult problem. And the story problem read a little bit differently. Dillon has some toys. He goes to the store and buys 4 more toys. So we have that action. If he buys more, we know that that's addition, getting more. Whereas, again, in most of our, we have to be on the lookout for the presentation of addition as meaning put together, and that limited meaning of addition instead of the part whole meaning. Okay, where students can begin to see the relationship between addition and subtraction. And then we have the total or the whole amount is 9. And I just quoted our textbook down here is saying when the start is unknown, this is the most difficult, probably because students modeling the problems do not know how many counters or fingers to put down to begin modeling the problem. So didn't have that starting spot. He was wanting to do something with the 9 and the 4, but wasn't quite sure what to do. And last but not least, some of you with the Greg Tang's Break Apart site, you got to experience division in a different way if you chose the quotative game. When we were looking at how many groups of is the language that could be used. But in problem number 6, where we have the fair share meaning or the partition division, okay, that, in my opinion, that kind of taps into, you know, kids who have grown up in appropriate social settings where they know that they have to share and they have to share fairly, and that will be the more common of the two types versus the measuring out. And the second, which is seen in problem number 7, allows students to be more successful with the division of fractions when the fraction is less than 1. So it's important that we build operation sense, presenting for our students or exposing them to all forms with these different problem structures. And kind of being on the lookout too, understanding that the structure may cause difficulty for our English language learners. So there were some excellent recommendations on page 151 in the left-hand column that you might want to go back and highlight. Thanks for tuning in.